Now, an interesting part about this, primarily for genealogists, is that the records for all of those places, all those different places, may be in the National Archives of the Torre do Tombo, which is the National Archives building here in Portugal. That's the good news. And the good news further is that most of those records are available online, or many of them are, not directly from the large family search genealogical websites like Family Search or Ancestry or whatever, but directly from Portugal. To begin, and this is the basic fact, this is how you get started with doing genealogy in any Catholic country. If you want to say Spanish-speaking or Catholic country, you'll have exactly the same process. And the process is very straightforward, although not simple. And the straightforward part of it is you need to know a complete name of the person, an approximate date of at least one person, and an exact place, which preferably is the name of the church where an event occurred. Okay, so let's suppose that your ancestors came from Brazil and they came from Portugal, and you wanted to do research first in Brazil, and then you wanted to do the research in Portugal. Well, to establish a beginning point for your research in Brazil, you would need to know this information, the complete name. And when we say complete name, we mean complete name of the individual, because there are an amazingly number of people with the same names in all Spanish-speaking countries. And the approximate date. Now, dates are not entirely, all the date will do is cut down or limit the amount of page-by-page research that you're going to end up doing, looking for any individual. Even if you get even if you have an index to a record, you need to make absolutely sure that you have the right person and that you are working in a very, very specific geographic point. You know the exact place that the events, because otherwise you're going to be looking for, you're going to be very easily for you to pick up someone with the very same name that you think is the right person. So now when you're in that position, then you have the ability to start looking for specific individuals. Now, at some point in time, you may run into the fact that your people came from Portugal, in which case you have to go through this process again. In other words, you can only begin your research in Portugal looking for a Portuguese immigrant to either Brazil or some other country, unless you know specifically the name of the person when they left, that they were using or had when they were in Portugal, and an approximate date and an exact place in Portugal. It doesn't help to have a general part. There are hundreds of parishes in Portugal. And just kind of a word about the Spanish language and Portuguese language church records. All Catholic church records are based on the geographic subdivisions of the Catholic Church. The smallest subdivision is the parish that has a parish priest. And a group of parishes is basically put in together, and they are called a diocese. And the diocese often has a bishop in charge of the diocese, but maybe a priest or some other official of the church. But there's a relationship, because it's customary in the Catholic Church for the diocese to make a copy of the parish registers periodically, usually annually. And so you can usually have two different places to look for the records. If you can't find them in a parish, you may be able to find them in the diocese. And if you can't find them in the diocese, you're going to have to look for the parish and find out which parish it was where they lived. Now, a parish can be a very small geographic area, particularly in a major city. And so the accuracy in learning and progressing in doing research in Portugal or in in any other the Catholic country depends entirely on following this scenario of knowing the names and the dates and the place. And we'll get into why you need to know the names so specifically when we get, or need a complete name, just as I go along here. So this is the main reason. So many names are common that finding one person requires very careful research. You really have to look carefully. The names can be extremely, very, very common. And basically, Portugal's personal names are not only sometimes hard to decipher because of the handwriting, they're very difficult because they are complex. They're very complex names. And in some cases, for example, it's not uncommon that in Portugal that a married woman has 2 names and 6 surnames. So they can have 2 from their mother's family, 2 from her father's family, and the last 2 coming from her husband. Some of these names may be made up of more than one word, so that a full feminine name can have more than 12 words and up to 15 or more words. That's one name. And if you have a string of people that have names that are 15 words long, you have to be very careful that every one of those 15 names is exactly the same, because you're going to have 2 people could have just one of those names different. And so this is it can be a very interesting exercise to pull out the full name of some of the women in Portuguese. And so what happens here also is a great benefit, of course, because now when you have one of these very complex compound names, you basically have an outline of 2 generations of a family. And so you have both the mother's and father's surnames. And so you have really going back another generation because those names are made up of their parents. So this is it's a little bit complex, but it's very beneficial to genealogical research. And sometimes I wonder why we all didn't do it that way, and then we wouldn't have so many troubles with people named with the same name. Another side benefit of this is that if you can identify this very, very specific place, once you find one name of a person, you basically have a key to researching further in the records and finding additional names, and you've already been given the surnames. And in the baptismal record, it's very possible that both the father and the mother are named completely. And so you have basically a way to get back and find the father's baptismal record and the mother's baptismal record, and then you have both their parents' baptismal records and both their wife's parents' baptismal records and so forth. And it is not unusual to use that information to go back until the records run out, and also come back on descendancy with many, many more. And in a lot of cases, it will be that you find that all of the people in a particular parish are related at some point. And so you can spend an awful lot of time. I have friends over the years that have gotten hundreds into thousands of names by simply going around and around and around in the same parish or very closely related parishes, and finding just everybody was related to them. And then if you take a DNA test, for example, you can then verify that what your initial research, at least back a few generations, is correct. It has been the case in Brazil and in other parts of Latin America that they have not been open to allowing people to have genealogical DNA tests, and that has only started just quite recently in the last couple of years. Previously, a couple of years ago, as I would talk to people in Latin America, they would say, no, they can't get DNA tests here, but now they can. There are some companies that have started providing DNA tests, and then they can use the same DNA information and put that into a larger program like MyHeritage that would allow them to upload the raw data. So it's kind of interesting that this would be a helpful development. Now, one thing that really helps all genealogists in various countries is that the Family Search Research Wiki, which is under the search tab there on the familysearch.org website, has genealogical word lists. Now, these were compiled many years ago into a series of books that we call the white books. They were paper-bound, were white 8.5 by 11 books that told the basics of research in various parts of the world, all around the world. And these white books were part of the initial seeding of the research wiki. So all of that information, including the genealogical word lists, were included. And so you're going to have word lists for the green parts over on the right-hand side of all those countries, Portugal and all the other countries down there. That would be very helpful in doing research if you don't happen to speak Portuguese. Oh, one more point, and before I move on, is that there are extra letters in Portuguese, and just like there are in Spanish. And so you need to look carefully at the alphabet. And when you do, then you may find that there are other letters that affect the way that if any of the texts are indexed and have been indexed alphabetically, then you need to make sure you're accounting for the fact that some letters may be alphabetized in a different way than you would normally think because there are extra letters. Now, the Portuguese Catholic Church records in Portugal itself date from 1562, when the Council of Trent of the Catholic Church mandated that parish priests were required to record births, marriages, and deaths. Now, there were some records that were recorded before that time, but they weren't mandated to be recorded. So that's sort of the official starting date for a general time when those records may have been better available. When you begin to do research, it's important that you get an idea about the Family Search Research Catalog. The Family Search Catalog. What happens here is that from a standpoint of records being outside of Portugal and available in the larger genealogical websites, Family Search has by and large the most records by far. There's really very few Portuguese records in any of the other websites as currently, by doing a search in each of the websites catalogs to see how many records they have from Portugal or primarily from Brazil. So what you're going to do is use the catalog a lot and become acquainted with the different Portuguese provinces, places within Portugal of all the different places, because that gets you started in narrowing down the area and the number of records that you would have to look at. So you need to search by parish for the church records. So you go into each of the areas in Portugal until you're down to the parish level, and then you'll see what church records are actually available. And as I mentioned, there's three major kinds of records. The first kind of record are baptismal records. And baptismal records in Portugal, as is the case in the rest of the Latin-speaking world, or all of the other countries, the Catholic countries, basically have the same format. And the same format has been used for, in some cases, hundreds of years. And so when you begin the process of understanding the records, the amount of information that you need to know, the language you need to know is mainly the names and place names and personal names of the individuals, which will be different. But the rest of the words in the records are usually consistent. They may change slightly over time, and they may not be as complete sometimes because the priests did not follow exact format. But generally speaking, if you pick up a record in any Spanish or Portuguese country, or Italian, or any of the other languages in Catholic, where there are Catholic records, even in English, you're going to find the records to be very similarly worded. So that makes it doable even if you don't learn a great deal about Spanish, you can learn how to decipher the records. Marriage records, back to baptism records. The one thing that I would mention is that the name of the person being baptized, the baby, generally is in the left-hand column of each page. So that lets you kind of go through and look quickly for names when you're searching these kinds of records. Another thing that's important is that we assume, I think incorrectly, that baptism or christening in the Catholic Church was always done at or near the time of the birth, and that is not correct. It is very possible that the person was not baptized until sometime later in their life. And often what does occur quite often is that you'll find that a person was baptized only shortly before they got married, because they went to get married in the church and the priest said, well, you haven't been baptized. So they had to go through the catechism and be baptized before they could get married in the church. So that's important to understand, that you don't automatically in any Catholic country put, say your birth date was the same as, or very close to, or even in the same year as the baptism date, unless you want to get in trouble down the road, because putting in that kind of arbitrary calculation saying, oh, they had to be baptized when they were 8 days old or something like that, that's not necessarily correct. There were factors of travel, of costs, and many other factors that basically have people baptized at a very different date than their birth date. Marriage records are also helpful because they have some information in the margins, in the edge, in the left-hand column. That helps you get at least into the records, but you've got to be careful here, because the name that is recorded there may not be the name that you are looking for. In other words, that may be their first name, and there was a tendency in Catholic countries to add the name Maria or Jose to almost every name when the person were baptized. So that can sometimes show up depending on that particular time and the particular place that the records are being searched. So you may end up not having the exact name, the total name of the person, until you do and go through and read the text. And burial records are just that. They're a record of the burials, and the burials have usually taken place around the periphery of the cathedral or someplace very close to the cathedral, and that's the burial ground. And so, of course, you can assume that the person died and that the death was probably not too many days different than the burial. The burial and the death are usually very close dates. But as I mentioned previously, the church records will record the burials, but the civil registration, when they're available, will record the death and not necessarily the burial. Okay, so in 1832, the government passed legislation requiring that births, marriages, and deaths of all residents be recorded at the local civil registry. And as I mentioned previously, that was only done by the churches before that mandate. This is the actual date of the beginning of civil registration, registros civis, that were done in, which were started in Portugal. This seems like it's just an arbitrary date. It was the date that they began the process, and that didn't mean everybody started with the process on that date. And that there's always an area called the time of compliance with the rule, and so you need to be aware of that. That civil registration records may only exist in certain areas in certain provinces, beginning on different dates, and sometimes that information is available, and usually is available from the Family Search Research Wiki by looking for Portuguese and then looking up Portugal and then looking up the individual provinces. This is not the good news. The bad news here is that Family Search only has a very few Portuguese civil registration records. Now we're talking about Portugal, not Brazil. So this would be Portuguese records. But Ancestry.com and MyHeritage don't have any. They don't show having any civil registration records as of the date of this. They may acquire some in the future, but right now, Family Search is the only one that has any. And that's checking both in the catalog and in the images records on Family Search. So that may change. So they may start to get civil registration records, but presently they do not. Now, the good news is that the records are available online and are searchable, and they are at the National Archive of the Tower of Tombo, or Torre do Tombo, and they can be searched directly from this website. So you can see that they've got a list of most views and then other recent records that they've been adding to it. So Portugal does have a rather extensive collection of digital records that you can go to get information and do some research. And they go back, the documents at the Tombo National Archive go back as far as 1161 AD. And just as a note, it has 87 miles of document shelves. So if you wanted a long exercise, or you wanted to do a sort of a long run, you could run the shelves or walk the shelves of the National Archives. So there's just a lot of records here. And as I indicated previously, these are records from around the whole world of Portuguese contacts around the world. So there may be some very unusual records here. So many of the parish records and civil registration records are on the Tombo website. It's tombo.pt. And you can see here's a list of records that were just recently added in 2023, parish books and numbers and numbers of books of records that are being added. So this is quite an extensive website, and will help get you going in Portuguese research. There are some other places where Portuguese records are available. They're somewhat limited access, but this one is at Dartmouth College. And it's called the Clare T. Carney Library, and it has Portuguese American genealogy. And from this list, it tells you a lot more information about which records they have and their specific records, and the places where those additional places where those records may be available. You'll see that Torre de Tombo is mentioned, and there are other archives, more local archives that also in their kind of regional archives, and so there is additional records that can be in places where the records could be found. Whenever you're going to be using this kind of an archive, you need to be very careful that you follow whatever rules or restrictions there may be on the archives, because your access is going to be dependent on your ability to follow the rules very closely and not get your access revoked. There's some more resources. There's the International Society of Genetic Genealogy Wiki, that's ISOG. And ISOG has a Portuguese genealogy resources for Portuguese DNA projects, as is the case now going around the world. As I mentioned, even though they're only recently now becoming available, Portuguese DNA, there are some records, there are some ways to match in Portuguese genealogy. This is kind of one key to being able to find the exact place of origin of particular ancestors. Even though you may not know enough to find or look for any records at all that are online, if you get a DNA test and find relatives that are matched to you and they are at specific places in Portugal, then you have a place to start looking for records. And they may also be on some of the larger DNA websites, particularly, as I mentioned before, MyHeritage. And from that standpoint, you can communicate directly to those people and find out what kinds of records that they may have. So it's opening up, genealogy is opening up dramatically because of the amount of information that is being gathered to the repositories, but also because of DNA connections that allow you to specify a particular area. To get some beginning information and some direction that is very valuable, you can go to the Family History Guide and go to the country section and look for Portugal records, and then you'll see some more specific instructions about doing some research in Portuguese genealogy. The BYU Family History Library has specific instructions for doing Portuguese genealogical research. And this is a document that was put together quite some time ago. These area studies kinds of instructions are old, but they are very useful because they can give you information about kinds of questions you need to answer in order to find a specific ancestor. For example, someone who immigrated to the United States or to some other country. There is also on the BYU website an introduction to Portuguese script tutorial. So you can take lessons. That's free. It's open. The script tutorial is in various languages and various scripts, and it'll help you immensely to go through these instructions to read some of the old Portuguese records. One thing that happens across Europe and basically around the world is that writing patterns, the way people wrote, were fairly stable and also fairly international. So when you're looking at a type of writing that was done in Portugal in the early 1800s or in 1700s, it's going to be very, very similar to writing systems that were used in other countries. Now, one thing that's very interesting about this is that in both Spain and Portugal, right around the time that the Moors were driven out of the country in 1492, that's the magic date. We think of that as being when Columbus discovered America, but it was even more significant for the Jewish population of Spain and Portugal, was that was when they were driven out of the country during that period of time. You may find that your ancestors came from Portugal, but that they left Portugal at an early period of time, and therefore they were Jewish. And so it's interesting, another byproduct of a DNA test is that it may tell you that you have Middle Eastern or even a specific Jewish group of connections. And this may be what happened. And that is that the Jews were sent around the world and left to both Spain and Portugal under pain of being killed or joining the Catholic Church. Now, another thing happened that was a little bit harder to understand. The Jews numbered in the tens of thousands, but they were expelled in 1536, and there's only about 1,000 Jews left in Portugal today. So there's not very many Jewish people in Portugal, but there's lots of people around the world who are descendants of Portuguese Jews. This is another possibility. The other possibility is that instead of leaving the country, the Jews ostensibly joined the Catholic Church. They were baptized into the Catholic Church, and for all intents and purposes, they became Catholics. But they maintained their own secret culture of being Jews. So they continued to observe all of the restrictions of Judaism. And so they were kind of on the Sabbath day, which we would be called Saturday, they were Jews. On Sunday, they were Catholics. And they were, as a group, they're known as crypto-Jews or crypto-Judaism. And so they were secretly Jews, but they were publicly professing another faith. So people didn't know they were Jews. And this is a fascinating history. And I have in just the last little while, the last couple of weeks, as a matter of fact, back at Rootstech, I talked to someone who had questions for me because they had discovered that their ancestors were Jews. These were crypto-Jews, that they had always assumed that they were Catholics or what other Church of England or whatever, and they weren't. They were practicing Judaism. They were also known as conversos, marranos, or anusim. So this happened beginning in the 1300s, and then when the Jews were driven out of Spain and Portugal. One interesting side note to that is that not too recent, but historical research into Columbus's, the crews on Columbus's boats, it turns out that many of these people were Jewish, and they had used that way of getting out of the country. So that was an interesting side note. One of the most active crypto-Jewish organizations is part of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society that's been around since 1985. And so this website on crypto-Jews will give you the information that you have about the king of Portugal who exposed the Jews in 1497. But they converted in name only. And this is an organization that has extensive documentation and contacts for finding out information about a possible crypto-Jewish ancestry. Okay, thanks for watching.